I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but talking about a subject that has resounded around the world, the statue wars. 2020 will be remembered in history for many things, including, of course, and perhaps especially, the coronavirus pandemic, which has cut a swathe across the world. But perhaps in second place to the remarkable features of this already remarkable year is the huge tumult which has occurred, particularly in the United States and in Great Britain, over what to do with slabs of marble and bronze and stone that have been erected to the great and good, or oftentimes, perhaps most oftentimes, to the not so great and often very bad. Personally, I've always respected pigeons that spend a lot of their time sitting on the heads, I said, of statues throughout the land. I never fancied having a statue myself because of that particular indignity. And of course, in the Arabic world, statues of human beings are decidedly rare. But in the United States and in the United Kingdom, and indeed throughout the Western world, they proliferate. Most of them were erected in a previous time. Most of them recognize the achievements, in heavy quotation marks, of people that would not necessarily cut the mustard today in public opinion, particularly those associated with the slave trade. This was a period, of course, in which Western countries, Britain preeminent amongst them, an industrialized system existed whereby millions of black Africans were literally shackled into boats as property, not even as beasts, but as property, and sailed across the oceans, those that managed to survive the journey, that is, and literally sold to plantation owners, to the emerging agricultural interests in what we call the New World, and their children too were born into slavery. Indeed, many generations were. So the question immediately arises in a more politically conscious period about what to do with statues to slavers, or in the case of the United States of America, statues to the heroes of the Confederacy, which fought a war, a giant war, in the late 19th century in America over whether or not slavery should be abolished. And in fact, it's gone further than that. Not only are people seeking to pull down statues to the leaders of the Confederacy, but are now turning their attention even to statues of those who fought the American Civil War to end slavery. Not least because those who fought the war to end slavery then turned their armies westwards to continue the genocidal annihilation of the original American population, the Native Americans. Of course, it gets more controversial still when war memorials, or for example, the statue to Winston Churchill, right in the heart of London, opposite Parliament, you might call it the best situated statue in the whole of Britain, when people are trying to pull that down. Now, Winston Churchill was at one and the same time a man who committed many, many crimes against the empire, but who also saved not just Britain, but arguably the world from the absolute domination, which might have gone on until now, of Adolf Hitler, his fascist Nazi regime. That's the hottest one of all. For the moment, his statue seems safe, but it may be the only statue in the Western world that is more or less guaranteed to stay where it is for the foreseeable future. Now, I'm joined, as always, by a panel of distinguished experts, both here in the studio and externally via video link. And so let's go straight into this. Robert Olds is the director of the Bruges Group, a think tank. Fair to call you, Robert, a conservative, a man of the right. Do you see any validity at all in those who wish, for example, to pull down these statues of slave traders?
There's no point trying to reinvent history or to hide history, to abolish history, to memorials to people. What we need to understand is that there was a different morality, a different ideology, a different economic system. Every single country had, to one degree or another, a system of slavery or forced labour. Every single nation that's engaged in agrarian economics would have had this at some point in their history. Every single person in this country would be descended to a degree from someone who would be been considered a slave, because they now regard serfdom in its most extreme form as a part of slavery. We can't just wipe out history. What this is an activity which is hysteria which is going on at the moment, which is showing. It's where dividing people. It's saying we know the rules. We can speak the language that's appropriate. We are woke. We know who is acceptable and who is not. And it's about differentiating themselves from ordinary people who may attach themselves to the past, to their notions of their community and their country and their heroes, be that Winston Churchill or people from the past who lived in different ages. And we can't impose our morality and our understanding on people that lived centuries before. That is a fool's errand, because no country had a democratic system of government or wealth distribution or welfare state or a health service, the things that we regard as absolutely key to our notions of life today. So there's no point, and we're just distracting from real issues.
We can't wipe out history, neither can we rewrite it. But does that mean we need to go on commemorating people who did bad things?
Well, they may not have understood that they were doing bad things, but what we can do is show that these statues are there and allow people to understand it. If we remove it, then there is as if they have never existed, and then we can never actually judge what they did and what the implications are to this day, if indeed there are any. But we need these statues there. We need to remember our past. This is where we all came from to a degree. It shaped our history. And to move forward, we need to know where we came from and have an eye on the past so that we can move forward and make correct decisions now.
Did you feel the same about the pulling down of the statues of Stalin and Lenin at the end of the Cold War?
Well, not all of those were removed. Sometimes, say for instance, in Ukraine, they would take down a statue of Lenin, but that's really more to do with a rivalry between the Russian interest in Ukraine.
Surely, by your logic, they should have kept it up there so they could understand.
Well, indeed, in Estonia, which is a country which left the Soviet Union, embraced free markets, they still have memorials to Chinese people who fought for the Bolshevik side in their war of independence. They still have memorials to Marx and Lenin, possibly because they can't be bothered to take it down, but also because they understand this was a part of their history. Yes, they suffered incredibly. Around 10% of their population was killed when they were retaken or taken into the Soviet Union. But they keep them there as reminders, and that is appropriate.
Jerry Downing, fair to say, you're the polar opposite of Robert Ould, a left-wing socialist, a revolutionary man. Expelled by Labour, like myself, though you're much more revolutionary than me. Where do you stand on that?
Well, first of all, I'd point out that Edward Colston's statue in Liverpool was erected 174 years after he died. So it wasn't a contemporary statue.
The one in Bristol, you mean?
In Bristol, I mean, yeah. Yes. And the reason it was erected at the time was, of course, to counter the campaign for the abolition of the slave trade and to counter the campaign for the abolition of slavery. I would mention that Wilberforce, the foremost campaigner for the abolition of the slave trade, was not opposed to children under the age of 9 working down coal mines. He was quite okay with that, but he didn't. He wanted to abolish the slave trade for economic reasons. Also, I would say that in 1843, Marx wrote a book or a little pamphlet on the Jewish question, and he pointed out what was wrong with all the bourgeois constitutions that had come in, the American Constitution and the French Constitution. He said, well, you had a regime of rights. Every man and woman were equal before the law, in you could vote, etc., etc., but they weren't really equal. So the man who formed the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, was a slaveholder. And so was George Washington. And of course, as slaveholders, you whipped your slaves. You had to do that because they would just go away, wouldn't they? They didn't like being slaves. They would go. So they regularly whipped their own slaves. They weren't as bad as the southern slaveholders, of course, who were far worse. They regularly whipped their slaves to death, etc. But they were hypocrites in the first degree. All men are created equal, except black men, except Native Americans, a whole number of except all white supremacists are created equal. That is the lesson of the American Constitution, I would say.
Now, Dr. Stephen Wilkinson, you're a lecturer in politics at the University of Buckingham. You're our academic in this debate. Would you try to steer a middle course between these two positions?
I think it's an interesting debate for a number of reasons, and I would say that, with all due respect, that it's a little bit absurd to suggest that these people didn't know they were doing bad things when they were slaving.
When they were whipping their slaves.
Indeed, the actual origin of racism, as we understand it now, is bound up within the slave trade itself. It was justifying the unjustifiable enslavement of other human beings by suggesting that they were less than human. I mean, you had to dehumanize these people in order to enslave them, and that's where racism actually comes from.
Absolutely not. No. That's absolutely incorrect.
No.
Racism is more prevalent in actual countries such as in, for instance, Eastern Europe, where they actually didn't have colonial empires. The countries that are the least racist in the world in this day and age are, of course, the United States, Britain, other countries which are more open to the rest of the world, more racially diverse than these countries. So to argue there's an economic background to racism isn't correct.
His point.
Much as you're very welcome to your opinion, I have to disabuse you of it to some extent. I mean,
opinion polls show we are the least racist.
When you look at it historically, I'm afraid the origins of, in actual fact, the racism of the 20th century. What led to the Nazi regime that you referred to was this notion of a scientific basis to the understanding that there was a gradation of intelligence amongst human beings. It was a Darwinian application to human society, and it was done actually quite maliciously and nefariously by the people who wished to maintain their supremacy.
And opposed by moral people in Britain at the time. But what about Robert's initial point that you can't rewrite that period, you can't wipe it away. All you're doing is just sort of displacement activity. You're not actually changing anything by bringing down a statue.
Yes, George. The whole argument, myself, to me, throws up this question about symbolism. So what we're talking about really are symbols. And symbols mean different things to different people. And I was very moved by one of the Black Lives Matter people in the United States. I can't remember his name now, but I just caught it on the radio, where he was talking about the the way in which the effect of having to walk past a statue of a slave had on him growing up as a black person in the United States, that there was this civic commemoration of this person that had been responsible for what was a genocide, and having to walk past it every single day of your lives for black people is a tremendous indignity and pressure upon them. And so the symbols themselves are part and parcel of what is a panoply, if you like, of an ideological constraint, which is racism, which still exists in modern society, and the only people who really feel it are obviously black people. And, you know, it's a pity there isn't a black person here today with us, George, because they might be able to speak, you know, from that experience. But I empathise strongly with that feeling that they must have. Honestly, these people have been protesting about these statues for years. It's actually tremendously... they've been very constrained in actual fact. I'm surprised these statues haven't been torn down before.
Let's go to Washington, D.C., to Helena Cobban, who's a writer on world affairs and president of Just World Educational. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Dr. Helena, welcome to Kalimahora. There are some that say that the politicians have simply failed on these issues, and that now is the time for direct action.
You know, George, I'm currently living in Washington, D.C., but 3 years ago in August 2017, I was still living in Charlottesville, Virginia, when we had, throughout that year, 2017, there were a series of events that culminated in the big confrontation where people living in the city, black people and white people, wanted to remove or drape black cloth over some of the statues of Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and so on. And then white supremacists from all around the country came and to protect the statues, and they came with many of them openly carrying large weapons. It was very scary, and there was the one person who was killed, Heather Heyer. So this thing has been going on a long time, this very intense confrontation over statues here in the United States. Now, in much of the United States, especially in the South, these Confederate statues of the Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, there's a whole lot of them, they were erected on public space, often with public money, at a specific point in American history in the early 20th century, when white supremacists who still had very strong networks wanted to claim public space with these statues and memorials. And that's what a public statue really does. It sort of says, this is our space and our version of history is going to dominate here. So they did that in the early 20th century as a very strong message to especially African Americans that their claims for equal rights, voting rights, economic rights, all kind of rights was not going to be, they were going to be suppressed. They would continue to be suppressed. And this was also a time of a lot of lynching of African Americans in towns and cities and counties across the whole South. So it was a really, it was a time when white supremacy was asserting itself. So that was the origin of the statues in Charlottesville, Virginia. That's the origin of a lot of the statues around this country.
What's the best way forward in your view?
So just back to what happened in Charlottesville, we had tried through the city council for a long time to get, a public discussion. What do we do with these statues? Should we, remove them to a different place and, put different statues or signs around them? There was a lot of discussion, but in the end, it became a big confrontation. I mean, I'm sure that maybe people who walk down that street in Bristol in the UK, or people who walk down the street in Richmond, Virginia, and they have become used to these Confederate statues, white people. But for African Americans, those statues were always an insult, that public space and public money is being dominated by these people. So you can say it seems very like hasty to tear down a statue, and it maybe hurts some people's feelings. I understand that, George. But honestly, you know, we've had 400 years of settler colonialism. We had in there 250 years of enslavement of Black people. And since the end of slavery, there's been a huge continuing campaign to deny African Americans their rights.
What should be done with Mount Rushmore in the United States?
Oh, the Mount Rushmore, you know, this is some sacred cliffs for the Lakota Sioux people there. And then they were carved into these massive, great representations of some white American male presidents, as we know. I've actually been there. It's a beautiful place. You can see why it would be, you know, sacred for the Native American peoples there. They were carved again in the early 20th century by somebody who was a big supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. So this white supremacy thing, it's everywhere. And I guess, you know, what do we do with them? It would be a heck of a job to try to bring down those big statues. Maybe they should, you know, we should just make an enormous big black veil and put it over them to mark the death of white supremacy. But you know what? I think maybe we should leave it to the Lakota Sioux people to decide what to do with it.
Robert, I'm sorry to return to this point, but at the end of the Second World War, after the fall of Berlin, the death of Hitler, we destroyed every last remnant of memorabilia, of statuary, of the fascist dictatorship. We denazified, in fact. We did wipe out the history of that period. Although you're a conservative, you're certainly not a fascist. You presumably would have approved of that.
The Nazis had been in power. Well, they weren't fascists. They were Nazis. They've been in power for 12 years and committed the most heinous crimes, amongst the most heinous crimes of the 20th century. The Mount Rushmore statues, to argue that only the Lakota tribe have a claim to that territory is not quite correct.
Well, in fact, they did have a treaty that did give them the...
Well, we remember people like George Washington now for someone who actually didn't stay on in government, that gave it up, as like Cincinnatus in the Roman times. Thomas Jefferson, who is remembered for, of course, we can understand his troubled nature now and how he wrestled with his own slaveholding economic power that he held in his area. But it's someone who we understand now for limited government, for not wanting to oppress people, have a system of government that, so we can remember the positives, but they're only focusing on the negatives about these people's personal lives, when we should be celebrating.
Whip one slave and it stays with you forever. The point, though, surely is that, as was said by people of your political stripe in England at the time of the Revolutionary War, to free the colonies from London, it's funny how all these people who talk about rights and the need for freedom and so on, are all of them drivers of slaves. Much more of this after the break. You're watching Kali with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, but talking about the statue war, which has predominantly been fought in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Jerry Downing, Robert had a point, didn't he, towards the end, that if we view everything through the prism of political correctness, identity politics, race, we're missing the really big question, the ultimate identity, which is class, surely.
Well, I don't agree with him there, actually. The point I would make is that what spreads disunity and divide and conquer amongst the working class is precisely racism. You cannot unite with your black brother if you are a white supremacist. And it is that racism that's been pushed, and it is deep, and of course, within the working class movement itself. So you really must, you've got to fight that. The big theoretical inspiration for Hitler was Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was the Übermensch man. He knew who were the Übermensch, and he knew who are the Untermensch, and the people that should stay down and the people who should rule. And it is that ideology that is absolutely hostile to the species essence of humanity. There's nothing more disgusting than the snob and the elitist when you meet them in places that I am better than you.
Well, I just heard it from you. You're talking about working class people and how racist they are.
Some working class people are racist. You must
very few in these days.
You must confront the racism of the working class itself, of course. Lenin makes that point in What Is to Be Done. He said that the model for the revolutionary was not the English trade union branch secretary, but the tribune of the people. Every injustice in every section of the class or of the country had to be fought, and the reason that it had to be fought was then to demonstrate your universal struggle for human liberation. That is, you can't have human liberation where one section of the oppressed is looking down on another section. And the great progressive thing about the Black Lives Matter is the nature of the Black Lives Matter, that there are more white people than black people on it. Now, that wasn't the case in the Los Angeles riots in 1994 over the Stephen King thing, and nor was it of Rodney King. I mean, when that happened, white lorry drivers were pulled from their cars, etc. The Korean population were attacked, etc. The Latinos and the blacks united against the white. But this time it's a cross-class thing. The white population that are coming out demonstrating, and they're young white people, they're demonstrating in solidarity.
It's the white middle class of virtue signalling to show how they're different.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's get a fresh perspective from outside the studio. Dr. Annie Wakar is an academic and a consultant, as well as an artist and a writer on international affairs. Dr. Wakar, welcome to Kalimahora.
Right. Thank you very much for having me here.
Doctor, what should be done with controversial statues and memorials that are still standing around the world?
We can see that most of the times these statues that have been placed there had some sort of a past behind them. Now, obviously not looking at what these statues were built for, why they were there, we need to understand that we can't just take them down. There needs to be an understanding, or there needs to be put forward some sort of an explanation as to why those statues were built at that point. Now, there's a lot of talk about how, these statues need to be, they need to go to the museums. And then the museums need to actually put forward some sort of an explanation as to why these statues were built and why these statues were placed in certain, locations. I think that perhaps is an interesting idea, but I think it does not focus on the fact that why on the first place these statues are not taken as something quite celebratory, in terms of especially the sort of movements that we are having at the moment. The one in Bristol, as you know, it was a slave trader. He was the biggest slave trader. And we need to really understand the ideas as to why, if it is being brought down, what really needs to be, do we need to put an explanation out there? Do we need to make another sort of not a memoriam, but I would say sort of a little, a plaque sort of explaining as to what this statue really was about, why was it built, when was it built, and maybe that's it. It really is quite an eye-opener that these things, even in this 21st century, are taking place, where we have actually moved beyond the slave trade. We have moved, away from all these things, but at the same time, they are at the heart of, the issue. And that issue needs to be addressed. And it can't be addressed if unless, you do something about it. You bring it a proper explanation.
In the past, many controversial monuments were erected, but surely the key question is what should happen to them now?
There is this blindness, in everyday life. We grow used to the space that we inhabit, where we live, and we stop seeing them. And that's the case with these statues. And we sort of grow and used to the ideas around us until we can't specifically see them. And the history and the past at this point are very relevant. If you look at the colonialism, the post-Cold War period, even the post-everything present, we see all the horrors of the 20th century that are behind us when we look at these statues. And especially if you deeply sort of go into the depth of understanding why these statues were built, there was always a blindness in our everyday lives. When we are passing these statues, we kind of just literally ignore them, and we see, they have been there forever. So it feels like forever. We never sort of think about why they are there until something like this erupts. Something like this that has happened in the past couple of months with regards to George Floyd, and how it actually had made this ripple effect across the globe. So I think it's important to understand, to wonder, to imagine, and to possibly see deeper into your own skin, whether you're white, whether you're black, you're brown, whatever color you are. It's that blindness of every day, and which I want to emphasize, that we get used to the spaces we inhabit.
Dr. Stephen, what about this argument that you need democratic mandates to take down statues? You can't just have anyone showing up with a block and tackle and pulling a statue down that they don't like. I mean, I appreciate that almost all of these statues were erected in a time when we didn't have democracy in this country. The mass of the people did not have a vote when most of these statues were erected. But what about the argument that, well, local people now in 2020 should be consulted by ballot as to what they want to happen with them?
Well, that would be a fine thing. I think we go back to the idea about democracy when they asked Mahatma Gandhi what he thought about democracy in Britain. He said he thought it would be a jolly good idea. And the quality of democracy that we have depends upon the voice that people have, of course. If democracy is the rule of the demos, the people, then we have to look to our democracy and ask what kind of a democracy it is. It's thrown up a leader that uses terms like pickaninnies and watermelon smiles to refer to black people. He talks about women walking around in burqas as letterboxes. This is
This is Boris Johnson you're talking
I'm referring to our Prime Minister, and our democratic system threw that leader up. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the quality of democracy? And what is democracy? And these questions arise, thankfully, because we have demonstrations like this, which, in my view, whether it's right or wrong to tear down the statue, the fact that it was torn down has provoked this discussion. And I think the discussion itself is an extremely healthy one, because we need to address these things. How democratic is our society? And how are they going to decide what they're going to put in the place of Mr. Colston? And who is going to have a say in the end as to who it should be?
Jan Reid.
And
Jan Reid.
These are very good questions to ask, I would say, I really do. And I think that's a good thing that's come out of this.
What about the argument, I've often cited it myself, that we should create a kind of graveyard of statues that are no longer in tune with the times, but nonetheless can be visited and some perspective gained on what they did, rather than have them in public spaces without explanation, where they have the chilling effect that Dr. Wakar described there.
Yeah, I mean, that's an option, I guess, but that wouldn't address the actual systemic racism that exists.
No, but
that's the point. You can get rid of the statues, you get rid of the symbols.
Does everyone tearing the statues down know that, though? Or do they think that by destroying a symbol of something, you kill it? You might actually make it worse. I mean, arguably, Donald Trump's electoral prospects, which look a little dim at the moment, are improved by scenes of wild disorder and vigilante action and so on the streets?
Well, yes, indeed. And it's a good point you make, George. I wouldn't disagree with that at all. And in fact, of course, that's the point I think that you were referring to, the idea of divide and rule. That if you can engender a sense of grievance amongst the white supremacist, I have to say, working class, then you will may be able to engender support for oneself. And that is the real danger, because that division in society is what, you know, the fascism, Nazism, if you want to call it, thrived upon. It was the demonizing of the other on a racial basis that led to the way in which that democracy was lost.
Or there's your virtue signalling and your demonising of working class people. A lot of this, George, is being driven not by a desire to get rid of racism. Indeed, actually, some people who may be calling for this could be inverted racists, who think that, say, for instance, a black person or someone of a different ethnicity to being otherwise white needs to be somehow protected. But what there is going on here is the opportunity of virtue signalling, because it gives you a reward. And the reason this happens the most in Britain and America, because addictive behaviour is most generated when the rewards are intermittent. Racism is harder to find in Britain and America, though sometimes it will exist, because it is here, because it is rare. Therefore, people search for it even more. They hunt it out to try and get the opportunity to show how woke they are, to show how politically correct they are, to show they understand the language. And it's all very bourgeois and very middle class. It's about having the right etiquette, the correct thing to say, for instance, at a dinner party. It is now the fashionable thing that Mrs. Bouquet would talk about, where previously she would talk about inviting some cousin of a minor aristocrat. Now the thing to show your wealth and your sophistication and to show you're different from ordinary working class people, to be a snob, is to talk about how racism is the most important issue. Or you can even trump that by talking about transgenderism if you really want to show off. And it is, the reason this exists is because people want a virtue signal, because they want the opportunity to show off, and that's what's driving. It's an easy thing. We can talk about, George, let's take about down that statue, but that does nothing to address the lives of ordinary working class people, whether they are black and white.
And the working
class people are the most racially integrated with other races.
I mean, to use terminology like virtue signalling and wokeism is actually kind of destroying the argument. I've not used that terminology.
You were calling,
and I wouldn't use it, and I don't actually identify it whatsoever in what I said.
You're calling people white supremacists.
And, you know, accusing me
with you
of middle class, being middle class, is really kind of rich, because
you're a professor at a university.
You know,
you're in a higher income bracket.
Labels to people and making suppositions about them based upon, you know, that's the
But you were calling people white supremacists. That's deeply insulting. To correctly identify your socio-economic status isn't an insult, unless you're insulted by being in the top. By being a higher tax earner
I'm not
most
virtue
working
signalling,
people.
and B, I'm not woke. And, you know, you've just accused me of the two things just because of what I said.
Stephen's not remotely a liberal, and he is working class, even if he's a white-collar worker. Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to sort of bring the discussion back to this point about race and class. I mean, that is I'm not wishing to kind of make it all about race by any means. What I tried to do was to draw people's attention to the way in which racism originates and how it coincides with the growth of slavery. And of course, when you talk about class, then you had a class of black people defined by their race who were below the white working class. So when the white working class is a victim of racism too, because it is given a status above that of another worker. And that is how the system perpetuated
This is not
itself.
factually correct.
It is factually correct.
The people that policed
working class people of Manchester
slavery
went on
were the
strike
white
because
working class of the southern United States.
The working class
who were in themselves denigrated by the whites, the upper class, because they were labelled as white trash. The terminology coincides again with the establishment of slavery. And George, just to make the final point, and this is a bit of an intellectual leap, but people need to understand this, democracy in America only became possible because there was a black subaltern class. Why? Because the whites found a common cause of keeping the blacks down. The fact is that white society was divided by religion, Catholics and Protestants. The Civil War was also fought in the American colonies, remember. But the fact of the matter was, with the introduction of large numbers of black slaves that needed to be policed, there became a common cause of white people which broke down the division of religion that divided them. It united the whites and it enabled an argument for a democracy of whites to emerge in the United States. The origin of the United States itself is not just an accident of slavery, it is a consequence of slavery.
Robert, you're not disputing that there is such a thing as white supremacy. That's what the Ku Klux Klan exists for.
The Ku Klux Klan's a defunct organisation.
Well, I'm afraid not.
And if we're talking about Britain and working class people here, Britain, according to the opinion polls, yes, there will always be problems, is the least racist country. And textile workers in Manchester refused, they went on strike, they refused to be making textile clothes out of cotton.
Yeah, and they were good Irishmen.
And which was against their own economic interests. They refused to work knowing that the slaves were producing this material.
Yes,
and
whereas the British government, the English government itself supported the South, of course. The government supported the South, but the working class, its sympathies were with the oppressed blacks.
If you go to Manchester, you will find there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Manchester, donated
for that reason. Yeah.
For that reason. But you have to remember that the people that went on strike in Manchester were not English; they were Irish workers, and they had family that had migrated to the United States who were fighting on the side of the North in the war.
But shouldn't
they were receiving letters from their family members asking them to support the struggle.
The North,
and that is why they did it. It was solidarity amongst the Irish working class.
Robert, just 1 second. Many people would say that that statue of Lincoln in Manchester should be brought down because Lincoln was a central part of the annihilation of the Native American population and the westward expansion of the Union. What about that?
He was, because he carried out the single largest mass execution of Native Americans. 38 were mass executed. Lakota Indians were massacred. I had a debate about that, and people said, you know, he wasn't so bad. 303 of them were initially sentenced, and he saved the rest of them, so he hanged only 38. What a good man.
Lincoln
He was also a self-declared white supremacist.
Yeah,
In 1858, he declared that in no way would he tolerate equality between black people and white people. He didn't think black people should be elected to juries. He didn't think they should be allowed to marry white people. He was opposed to all that, and his letter to Horace Greeley again says, if I could save the Union, not free any of the slaves, I would do that. So he himself was a white supremacist. So all that stuff about rights and all that stuff about, until you get real equality really down there on the ground, and you are really equal to your brother and sister, then you will not have socialism, which is what I always fight for, and that's what they're all afraid of.
Robert, you don't fight for socialism, but you do believe in capitalism. And all these things, serfdom, slavery, and so on, these are deformations standing in the way of capitalism, weren't they?
Yeah, slavery was not capitalism, neither was serfdom. I'm in favour of capitalism, yes, because that brings the greatest prosperity to the greatest number. That's the best way of getting jobs into inner cities, is to have a free markets. Of course, a good education system, good infrastructure, all those things that are needed to underpin it. That would be the best way to create wealth, and people can lift themselves out of it. What I'm not in favour of is woke capitalism. All these causes now we're talking about, the Black Lives Matter and so forth. This is just a way of large corporations having the opportunity to virtue signal, to pretend they're the good guys when they're employing people in China or in Bangladesh for 20 cents or 20 pence an hour, or perhaps even less, while they pretend that they're against capitalism, selling products to consumers who pretend to be socialist and also hate capitalism. It's a big con. And all the time, these organisations, companies such as, say, Facebook or Google, and they're pretending, they're essentially monopolies. That's one thing I'm also opposed to, monopolies. They're all pretending and funding these movements because it gives them an opportunity to virtue signal and say, look at us, look how we care for various minorities. Oh, don't pay any attention to the fact that we're not paying any taxes, or we don't want any regulations. Silicon Valley is very left wing when it comes to virtue signalling. When it comes to economic policies, they are for themselves.
He has a point, Jerry, doesn't he?
Yeah, because
if Black Lives Matter movement is such a good thing, why are all these big capitalist corporations giving them many millions of dollars?
Yes, of course they are giving them and sponsoring them in a lot of way and taking the knee when they victimise the man for doing it in the first place. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it is a movement from below. Of course,
except it's top down.
There are leaders there that are not accountable for. It doesn't have a centralised structure. You can't as such take it forward. But like the Me Too movement for women's equality, it is a movement that finds its expression amongst the poorest and the most oppressed. And when
well, that's not true, is it? That's simply not true. Just like Extinction Rebellion turned out to be the most middle-class people in the country, the children of the most middle-class people in the country. The Me Too movement and even Black Lives Matter, these white people that are on the demonstrations, they're not coming from the American working class. These are the American educated, white, upper middle class.
Well, I mean, that may be the case. I would imagine that there's all kinds of people supporting it. I wouldn't categorise them because I don't know what the statistics are. But the phenomenon is that it is a black and white movement, and it is distinct from what has happened in the past. And it's all very... I mean, I'm amused by the fact that somebody who supports capitalism would be criticising the hypocrisy of capitalists. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, it's utterly hypocritical.
They're monopolies, people who are cartels. The social media companies are essentially cartels. Capitalism does actually require, occasionally, the state, because there's so many disruptions within the market, for monopolies and cartels to be broken up.
Unfortunately, the inevitable function of the capitalist market is to create monopoly. It will always end in monopolies of one kind or another. And as for this point you made about slavery not having to do anything with capitalism, of course, the origins of capitalism itself are bound up in the slave trade. And the whole of the modern period really is bound up in an understanding of the triangular trade. The wealth of Western Europe was developed from the excess exploitation of black people in that process. The accumulation of wealth in Britain, which led to the expansion of Britain and ultimately financed the Industrial Revolution, was all from the black labour. And when it comes to writing history, this is the point I was trying to make.
The economy was impoverished by slavery.
debate about statues does give us the space to actually broach some of these things which are fundamentally important and which people just do not know, because of course the history is written by white racists. Unfortunately, when a great black historian, C.L.R. James, said, when history is written as it should be, it will be the patience of the masses that will be remarked upon and not their ferocity. And that is the point he was making, was that the black people put up with an enormous amount of degradation and mistreatment of the most heinous kind for so long. And when they finally won their victory in Haiti, which people have just completely forgotten about. Why have they forgotten about? Because they erased the history of the Haitian Revolution. But it came in 1804, within 2 decades, 1 decade even, of the American Revolution, 2 decades of the American Revolution. It was the first republic, the second republic in the Americas, and the first republic that declared in its constitution that all men, regardless of race, are equal. And that was the work of a black slave rebellion. And if it wasn't for that black slave rebellion in Haiti, the French Revolution would not have freed slaves. And they had to fight again against a reaction from France when Bonaparte took over. He tried to reintroduce slavery on the island, and they fought them as well. And incidentally, they defeated a British army, and they defeated a Spanish army that was sent. And after the Haitian Revolution, what did all of the countries do, who were all still slave-holding countries? They blockaded Haiti, and they punished it. And they formed a cartel against it because of the example that it set to the rest of the colonies in the region. And that history needs to be learnt and understood by white people and black people. You can call it wokeism if you like, but the knowledge of true history is what I'm here for, nothing else.
Remarkable debate. I hope you agree. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة. You have been a wonderful audience. Thanks for watching.